The interesting thing about being on the ship is that we weren't usually out on deck after a certain time of the day. I did see something interesting. We were doing a training operation in Southern California in Camp Pendleton, and there was some weird stuff happening in the sky. I don't know what it was. And so I was exposed to a lot of what his work was and kind of understood it because he was open with us. I know there's a lot of things that he hasn't told me and my brother, and I don't think he ever will. My brother and I were sons of a detective. He was in the living room and he was watching a video, and then he left, but I could tell that he didn't want us to be around. And so my parents left to go do something. My brother and I were there, and of course, like curious kids, we popped it in. And it was him and another detective recovering a body from a reservoir that was nearby. And I made a call back to Oregon to my girlfriend at the time, and I'm sitting on the swing and talking on the phone, and the swing was just slowly spinning. I spun around, and there's this massive brown bear.
Holy shit.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it. If you move abroad and it doesn't work out, at least you did it. And you can make a decision to go somewhere else or go back. Nothing's permanent. You can always move on. And, you know, it's very cliche to say, but you're going to regret the things you don't do rather than the things that you do.
All right, good to go. Is the mics okay and everything for you?
Yeah, seems good to me.
So I am sitting here with Seth on his farm in Pedasí, Panama. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, because it's different for me, because I've been here for only 3 weeks. So I wake up every morning, and I'll put a picture of the view in the video version of the podcast. But I make coffee and I sit outside and I just think, what the fuck? Like, this is crazy. Growing up in New York and then having this view every morning. Do you feel that when you get up sometimes, when you're just like staring out at the farm, like, holy shit, like this is fucking insane?
I definitely used to in the beginning. And it's funny that you asked that, because I've had this conversation with my parents before, because they live in like northeastern Oregon, and their backdrop are these mountains, and it's just spectacular.
Yeah.
And so every time I go back to visit them, I'm just in awe, and I just stare at the mountains quite often. And I've talked to them about that in the recent past, and they're like, yeah, it's normal.
Yeah.
We don't see them, you know, it's like they've been there for so long. And so I feel kind of the same about this place. But if I take a moment, like if I'm in the pool with my daughter and just hanging out, and there'll be like a beautiful sunset or some sort of phenomenon that happens with nature, then I really kind of soak it in.
Yeah.
But the day to day, it's pretty normal for me.
I guess every sort of environment, every living situation has its own white noise, because I'll have friends that they stay in more remote areas than New York City, which is not saying a lot, because basically every place on the planet's more remote than New York. But they'll come in and they'll stay in the apartment, and then the next morning I'll wake up, I'm freshly slept, and they get up, I'm making coffee, and they're like, did you hear that homeless guy screaming outside the window last night? And I'm like, no, like that's literally just, I'm so used to it. Like I have an AC that is just blasting the entire night, literally just like homeless people screaming, people like walking down the street at 2 a.m. from bars. And I'm just like, when I'm out here, sometimes it's weird not hearing that.
Sure. And I think the homeless people screaming are the howler monkeys for us.
Exactly, yeah.
They were
looking for a tree.
Yeah. Well, the other night, I mean, I have the white noise of just the ceiling fan in the room, and it usually drowns things out. But the other night, the power went off about, I don't know, I think it was probably midnight. Actually, it was almost exactly midnight, because I looked at the clock, and it was out for an hour and a half. And at that exact time, I don't know if the monkey was kind of going on prior to that, but I definitely noticed it, because everything was dead silent.
Yeah.
And he was just down in the bottom, just going for it. And I was like, God. And that's where the white noise of the fan really comes in handy. I mean, I even went out and shined the flashlight down there, trying to like, hey, quiet down. Yeah. But it didn't work.
Yeah.
It agitated him more. But.
That's also an adjustment, a good adjustment that I've had to make internally, having lived in Panama for 9 months in total, is realizing that the power goes out in a lot of places around the world, and it doesn't always come back on in 2.5 seconds.
Yeah, exactly.
Here it's been pretty quick. It's only happened a couple of times, and within like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, it comes back on. Mm-hmm. But living in other parts of Panama, where it's just like the power goes out and it's just out for 5 hours or sometimes overnight, and people were just lighting candles and everything's fine and restaurants are still open. And I'm like, I guess this is just my own New York City instinct of being like, let's fuck it, like fix it right fucking now.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
like, where's the med? Like, all like this. But it's nice to like have that sort of reset, because that's not how most of the world lives. Like, most of the world does not live on top of each other in, you know, an apartment in Red Hook, Brooklyn, where every like there's a generator every 5 feet. Like, that's just not the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes a certain amount of adaptability to survive any length of time here, and kind of resetting the chip in your head and understanding like, hey, these things are going to happen. And I always say to myself, look, if the power goes out, and it's usually for me, like I work here at home building stuff, like whether it's furniture or whatever. And so I have my little workshop, and I mean, it's always frustrating when it goes out, because it seems like it's always happening when I'm right in the middle of something.
Yeah.
But there's no lack of things to do. So like in the beginning, when I was experiencing that, I just started telling myself, look, if the power goes out, you just find something else to do.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, at night, it's inconvenient sometimes when you're right in the middle of cooking dinner and the power goes out, but it's always going to come back on.
Yeah.
It might be 2 minutes. It might be 18 hours.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the longest that it's been.
Yeah.
We were doing some work here on the property, bringing some road-based material once, and a friend of mine has a big backhoe and a dump truck, and he wasn't paying attention, and he clipped the communication cables that go through the property. And this is the power line that goes all the way down to Playa Venal, and, you know, gives everybody power between here and there.
Yeah.
And it was an old.
It's a lot of people for Panama for sure.
Yeah. I mean, and a lot of people who have, you know, Playa Venal as a tourist area, and there's a lot of restaurants and stuff.
A lot of people in Playa Venal that are not from Panama.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's an expectation there.
Exactly.
And so he clipped it, and the post out there on the corner of the property it's not anymore. It was wood, and it was broken at the bottom for years, but it was just kind of staying there.
Yeah.
And so that little bit of energy knocked the whole thing out, and the power was out for like 13 hours.
Damn.
And I had people driving to try to find where the problem was, because it's kind of a classic thing that people do around here, because there's no real notification. The power company doesn't say, hey, we have an outage, it's going to be fixed. It's kind of on you to figure it out. So I had angry people showing up here, you know, asking when it's going to be back on. Yeah. So it was interesting, but it's just a fact of life out here.
Yeah, that's got to be scary. People coming up to your property and being like, when's the fucking power coming? Like, I know it was you. I know it was you.
It's pretty obvious since the power pole's laying down on the ground. But no, it wasn't that aggressive. But I mean, you could tell people were flustered, and for good reason. You know, but
I've heard some. One of my girlfriend's colleagues goes up to El Valle a lot, and he said that there have been instances where sloths are climbing on the power lines, and I guess, you know, there's an exposed spot every, 10, 15, whatever it is, and then a sloth will short circuit the power, get electrocuted, and die, but it'll affect, like, the block will go out sometimes because a sloth is climbing on the power line.
Yeah, it happens around here with the howler monkeys, and so there's been an effort by some of the nonprofit organizations in the area to try to, like, where these monkeys are traversing the road, to put some sort of insulator on the line so they're not getting electrocuted. Just last year, I was taking my daughter to school. It's about 35 kilometers away. And it's a beautiful drive. And as we were cruising through, I was like, oh, there's a monkey. And it was just stuck to the power line, dead, glued, so it's a frequent occurrence around here.
Yeah. So you said you grew up in northeastern Oregon?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you drove down here, and we'll get into a lot of stuff that happened before that, but you mentioned that you drove from Oregon down to Panama, or down to Central America.
Yeah.
What is that drive like?
It's interesting. So that was, I think, probably 4 years after I had moved here, and I had an old Subaru Outback up there that was just sitting there, and I was just like, it's a good car, it's really reliable. I think I'll drive it down. So I packed it up with everything and literally the kitchen sink that's in my house.
Yeah.
And packed it full. And I have a really good friend who came with me. And so I picked him up in Utah, and we left, and he has an 8-foot longboard, mini longboard. And so, I mean, I'll get into what the rest of it was like, but I mean, the initial crossing of the border in Brownsville, Texas into Mexico was interesting, because here we are, a couple of, Americans with an 8-foot longboard on the top of the car and no surf to be found.
Yeah.
And
they're like, is this a decoy? Yeah, like, are they smuggling something? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And within the first probably 40 minutes, we were pulled over, I think 5 or 6 times. And it was
40 minutes of crossing into Mexico.
Like within the first probably 2 minutes, boom, we were pulled over. And then maybe 4 or 5 times after that, within 40 minutes. And it was all just like, we stuck out like a sore thumb. So at that point, the realization came that we couldn't drive through Mexico with a surfboard on top of the car. Yeah. And so we stuffed it in between us. And so literally we did the whole rest of the drive through Central America with a longboard in between us. So that was interesting. But the drive was pretty uneventful. And in hindsight, looking back, I realized that it was probably a little bit more dangerous than I thought. But I think I just wanted to not think about that aspect. I think my parents knew, especially my dad. He was like trying to get me to bring a handgun and like put it under the seat of the car for protection. He's just that way. And I was like, man, that's going to cause more problems, because I know every border check, I'm going to be sweating. Are they going to find this thing?
Yeah.
But during that time when we crossed the border right there in Matamoros, Mexico, and Brownsville, there had been tourists that had been pulled out of their vehicle and shot on the side of the road. And I didn't really know that until after the fact. So
was it like a fake cop situation, or they just stopped somewhere and got pulled out?
Yeah, I don't know.
Because I've heard the fake cop thing a bunch in Mexico.
Well, and that's interesting too, because I definitely ran into situations where I'm like, are you a cop or not?
Yeah.
And one time we were pulling into I think it was Veracruz, and the highway opened it up, and there were like 4 lanes. And so we're driving along, and there were a bunch of cars on the road, and there were 2 cops standing just in between the lanes. And they were just pointing at cars saying, you pull over. And I don't know why. I mean, I don't know what their criteria for pulling somebody over was, but
I guess you don't need it in Mexico.
Of course, I was one of them.
Yeah.
And it kind of leads into a funny story, because he comes up to the window and he's talking to me, and it was the same story every time. My window tint was too dark, and I got my windows tinted just for the trip because I didn't want people seeing in. Plus, it's hot.
Yeah.
And so he, told me he's going to give me a fine. I had to go to the police station and all these things. And so at that point, I'd been through this so many times through Mexico. I was just like, all right, I know the deal. So I got out and went back behind the car, and I was just like, okay, how much do you want? Yeah. And I look up at him, and I took a good look at him, and he had his official looking uniform on, but he had this baseball cap on that was like bedazzled. And I think it said like love or something.
Like, I don't think that's cop issued uniform.
It was bedazzled.
It just says MPD on it and bedazzled.
Yeah. I think I said love or something. It was like, wear your daughter's hat to work day or something.
Yeah, exactly.
It was hard for me to take him seriously. Yeah. And I was like, well, how much is it? And he's like, no, don't pull out your money. People are going to see. And I was like, oh, okay. So I kind of did it, a little bit hidden, and gave him the money. And I said, okay, but how am I supposed to, now that I've paid you my fine for tinted windows, how do I know that your friend down the road 3 miles isn't going to pull me over and do the same thing? And he said, oh yeah, I'm going to give you a password. And I was just like, okay, a password. And he's like, hold out your hand. And I held out my hand, and he wrote Tortuga on it, which means turtle. Yeah. And I was like, okay, that seems pretty official. And and he's like, oh, I'm going to radio them too and let them know. And so he had a mic on his chest, and he grabs the mic, and I can clearly see that he didn't key the mic at all.
Yeah. Like,
it's standing in front of him.
It's like a 5-year-old, like Toys R Us mic.
It was also pink.
It says something like, play with me. Like when you press it.
Exactly. So he pretends to key the mic and says, he gives a description of the car and all that. And I was just, all right, thanks, man. And I got in the car and I was and my friend was like, what happened? And I was laughing so hard
Yeah.
because it was so comical. So yeah, the fake cop thing, I still don't know if he was real. I think he was real, but just maybe unprofessional.
Yeah.
But
that's pretty laid back to see the humor in the moment, because I feel like that would be a story I look back on and laugh about it, you know, like a month from then when I'm
Right.
telling a friend. But in the moment, I feel I don't know if I'd be able to laugh at that in the moment.
yeah, I think it was probably the amount of times we've been pulled over up to that point that was just like, okay, I understand how this
Yeah,
goes.
you're just like over it. You're like, here we go again. I wanted to go I want to go back to the surfboard thing, because I think it's hilarious that, because you know, before they pulled you over with the surfboard on top of the car, that they were pulling other white guys with surfboards that they had caught smuggling coke or like other things, where the Mexican cops are putting together like, oh, now like surfboard is a thing now for white boys smuggling drugs or smuggling
maybe,
something.
yeah.
And so it's hilarious. Like the most like unassuming kind of like chill bro thing of having a surfboard on top of your car is now like, oh, that person's carrying illicit materials,
right,
and we must stop them.
Well, and the interesting thing about that is you would think that the likelihood of a couple of white guys smuggling drugs into Mexico is
yeah it's like you have to explain to the cop logistically,
yeah.
Why would I buy drugs in America and sell them for even cheaper in Mexico? I'm going to buy your shit that's better quality and then smuggle it back, and then I'll take the surfboard down. And the cop's like, all right, you're free to go.
Well, and that was something, it's a great point, and that's something that it was a topic that was brought up on many occasions as I was crossing borders. So it was always stressful the day that we were getting to a border crossing, because you don't know what you're going to encounter. Are they going to hassle me because I have all these personal items in the vehicle? You know, are they going to make me pull it all out and search everything? And so I'd always have that conversation with the officials saying, look, I'm going south, you know, I live there, and like, just kind of let that set in with them, because everything's coming from south going north.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. What would you say? Obviously, you have the stops with the password Tortuga and then the surfboard. But overall, driving through Mexico, would you say you felt safe most of the time? Were you kind of always on edge? Because me and my girlfriend were thinking about it. We're probably going to end up selling the car in Panama and then heading back to New York. But at one point, we were like, maybe we should drive all the way back through Mexico. But you always hear those stories of like, and I know only the worst stories get exported to America. So it's like no one tells you the stories of traffic stops that went okay.
Right. Yeah.
But like all we hear in America and the US specifically is like, two surfers go surfing just over the border and they get murdered and they found them in a well, or like a police impersonator pull someone over, kills them, or someone takes a bad road and like bad shit happens. But like for the most part, did you feel okay, or did you always feel like you could be on the cusp of something shaky?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was always that underlying feeling that anything could happen. But we took certain precautions. I made sure to have a plan each day to know where our destination was and know that we could get there in the allotted amount of time and only driving during the day.
Yeah.
And so what I did notice, especially through Mexico, is you could see on the side of the road where they would set up at night. You could see like, kerosene containers and where they burn candles and chains where they'd stretch a chain across the road to stop vehicles for whatever reason,
kind of like the protests in Panama. They would just leave this stuff on the side and then pick up the next day.
Go home, have rest, and then come do it again at night, and so I definitely noticed that. So it was always present. I knew that there were things that could happen, but for the most part, we didn't have any problems, with the exception of the police, and they're just looking for a handout. And so, it was a good experience. And I've spoken to other people who have done the trip, because inevitably you meet people who come down and kind of have the same idea. And I haven't really heard any horror stories.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, living in the age that we do, where news spreads so fast and it's so easily acceptable. You're exactly right. The stories that you hear are the ones of like horror.
Yeah.
And especially the one that just happened recently in Baja California.
Yeah.
But I think that's true everywhere in the world. You know, you could go to the US and take a wrong turn and,
Yeah.
you know, get yourself into a lot of trouble too.
Yeah.
So
I told that to my parents because when I first started traveling solo outside the US, probably like 7 or 8 years ago, they would always, my dad is bad with just constantly barraging me with stories about bad shit that happens in the place that I'm going. I'm like, Dad, I don't need to fucking read articles about some guy that got beheaded in Medellin, you know, when I'm about to go there next week. And I send them like every time my dad does that now, I'll send him back something that happened like 2 blocks from me in Brooklyn. Like some guy gets shot. I'm like, literally, you don't give a shit about this. It's only because I'm going to Colombia. You know, you don't care about the guy that just opened fire on the subway 2 stops from me. And now he's kind of chilled with it. But that makes me curious too. Like, what were your parents like growing up in terms of allowing you to take risks or you know, giving you room to explore? Because my parents, you know, growing up in Long Island, they, you know, I feel like a lot of Long Island parents, it's like very middle upper class, like very like, oh, if we travel, like most of my trips when I was a kid, if we traveled, we were always staying like in a resorty type place, like never really went off on our own. Like if I did go off on my own, I'd have to, you know, like sneak away from my parents with my brothers. And obviously you've done so much exploring and we're going to get into more places, but like when you were growing up, did your parents encourage that? Like, did you have to break out of the shackles of your parents' expectations? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, so I think I was fortunate enough to grow up in a place and time where things were a little bit different. You know, I was born in 1979, so I grew up in the 80s and 90s, graduated high school in 97. And so this was like, for all intents and purposes, pre-internet. I mean, you had AOL and all of that. But also like the ability to communicate easily and readily through you know, cell phones wasn't existent. So I feel like everybody was just more relaxed about where your kids are and what they're doing. And we had a lot of freedom. I have an older brother, and we had freedom to, I mean, I would leave the house at 12 years old with a shotgun, and my parents wouldn't ask me where I'm going. You know, I'm just like, I'm going to go out shooting
we'll see you at dinner.
yeah. So we had a lot of freedom. My mom was a school teacher, and my dad was a police officer. He was a detective. And they're very contrasting personalities. My dad like is kind of wild, you know, and my mom is very like motherly educator, you know, and so I got a bit of both of those things. But I definitely think I got this streak of calculated risk from my dad, and maybe sometimes uncalculated risk. But
I feel like that comes with being a detective too. You just learn how to, you know, read people's body languages and read situations really well because you're constantly thrust into the middle of sketchy shit.
Well, and for a period of time, he was doing like narcotics work. So he was undercover and he was in situations where they were risky, you know, and then also just how he grew up as a kid, just a little bit more on the wild side. And so, I mean, I think there was always an understanding. My parents were very open with us about talking with us about responsibility and taking responsibility for your actions and being safe and all that. But we were afforded the trust by them to kind of just be kids. And it was pretty amazing. So
do you remember, like, have you had any talks with your dad as he was, I'm assuming he's retired now?
He's retired, yeah.
Did you have any talks with him when you became an adult where you're like, all right, I want to know the crazy shit that you did when you were a detective? Like, give me the details on your wild cases and like stuff that he would come home and you were 12 years old and he was clearly shaken, but like, obviously you can't share that type of stuff with a 12-year-old. Like, have you had any conversations like that?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's 2 parts that I have a 2-part answer to that. I think his openness and honesty exposed us to a certain degree of what he was dealing with when we were kids. I mean, he had a warehouse that was, I mean, within bike riding distance from our house, and it was a warehouse with a bunch of seized vehicles in it from different busts that they have done. And so I was kind of free to go there and say hi to him, and he had a little office in the corner of that building. And so I was exposed to a lot of what his work was, and kind of understood it because he was open with us. But the second part of that answer is that I know there's a lot of things that he hasn't told me and my brother, and I don't think he ever will. And I know this because my friend Peter, who drove down from the U.S. to Panama with me, lives in my hometown. He's not from there, but lives in my hometown, and he's become very close with my parents. And he's told me, he hangs out with my dad. Sometimes they'll have beers and stuff. And he's told me that my dad's told him stories that, and what he said, quote, "My kids don't even know this story."
Damn.
So I think maybe he feels comfortable saying it to somebody else that's not part of family.
Yeah.
But
kind of like when I've been in situations where, you know, it's late night and I'm in a bar, and then there's 3 guys in there, some random girl in the bar, and then the guy next to me will just turn to me and tell me about his shitty marriage, and I'm like, you haven't even told this to your wife. Like, I just met you 40 seconds ago. Yeah, right. But I feel like there is a comfortability in unloading to a stranger, like someone's, drunk at a bar, like you're, somewhere, wherever, where you're never going to see that person again, and it allows you to get it off your chest, but it's 99.9% of the time it's never going to come back to you. So you like get the feeling of getting rid of it without it affecting your life.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about that. And, I don't pry, I don't ask. It's just, we don't talk about specific instances. And I mean, I remember my brother and I were detectives, the sons of a detective. And so inherently we kind of have this like, oh, let's snoop around and see what we can figure out. And I remember the first thing that really opened my eyes, and I don't even know if he knows that we saw it, but he was in our living room, and that was back when we had VCRs.
Yeah.
And he was in the living room and he was watching a video, and then he left, but I could tell that he didn't want us to be around. And so my parents left to go do something. My brother and I were there, and of course, like curious kids, we popped it in, and it was him and another detective recovering a body from a reservoir that was nearby.
Oh God!
And so we got.
How old were you again?
I think I was probably, I would say I was probably 9 or 10.
Damn.
And
that's heavy shit.
Yeah, and so like, I mean, it was just right there in my face, and I'll never forget the image. And I mean, she'd been in the reservoir for a while, and there was like a weight tied around her ankle, and it was like heavy stuff. And I was like, oh, this is a reality of life. But I think through the years, all of that, being exposed to that, has given me like maybe a greater appreciation for the good in life, you know, and also understanding that there are good people and there are bad people. Yeah. And what bad people are capable of. So
do you feel like, can you remember every part of the videotape? Because I'm thinking back to like things that I've seen, and like nothing nearly as traumatic as seeing my dad pull a body out of a lake or a reservoir when I was 10 years old. But like the things that have happened, I feel like trauma is just recorded differently in your brain, where like for some reason, like there are things I kind of remember from when I was younger, and there are things that are just like, oh, I could like paint this thing if I wanted to, just because the way that my brain took it in. Do you feel that way with the videotape, where like I can remember exactly what was going on?
Yeah, I remember it. And memories are funny like that too, because I mean, maybe we don't remember exactly what it was, but maybe over time, envisioning that memory over and over, you create a different memory of what it was. But I feel pretty confident that I know exactly what it looked like.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's some certain details that I'm not going to discuss, but it was, it's definitely imprinted on my brain. Yeah. So yeah.
So he was working, it was narcotics in in northeastern Oregon?
Yeah, so we lived in a town that was kind of interesting. It was a crossroads town, and so there were a couple different interstates that came through, and so there was a lot of like trafficking of drugs just through there, and then
Gotcha.
like maybe unloading there to move on somewhere else.
Yeah. That's what I was gonna say, because it doesn't like you don't really think of the Northwest when you think of trafficking, but I guess people
Yeah.
moving stuff from like up from California or down from Canada, like you have to drive through somewhere.
Sure, and like there was it was I mean, northeastern Oregon for the most part is very like white cattle rancher.
Yeah.
You know, and this town had like a mix of all sorts of different people. I mean, we had a pretty large Mexican population. We had immigrants from like Vietnam and Laos, and so it was kind of like this conglomeration of different people. And so I think maybe like the good old boy, you know, cattle rancher mentality wasn't as there. It was actually, you know, it was a part of that community, but then there were other things in play. And so if you're in a place and you know, maybe your cousin wants to stay at your house as he's moving a shipment to Seattle or something, you know, I think it just leads, the crossroad town are kind of notorious for, you know, more illicit activity than just like
less people there to be nosy, get through quick on the interstate, quick.
So yeah, it was an interesting, I mean, that's not where I was born. We moved there for a while, and then my parents have moved back to where they live now, which is definitely like the cattle rancher quiet town. So,
do you feel like did your dad, being a detective and being involved in law enforcement, did that delay you getting into things like drinking and drugs later on as a, you know, teenager, if you did get into those things? Or was your dad like, you know, what, like, do what you want, just be safe?
I think it did delay. You know, when I was younger, I think I had my first beer when I was 17. And no drugs at all. And
I think I had it 16, 17, around that time. Yeah.
And it was interesting because like chain of custody was different back then. I mean, we're talking about the 90s. And like I would be eating dinner and there would be like a vial of cocaine on the dining room table.
Yeah.
But it was just like he came home to eat because he's working in the street, you know, and
like he lifted it off someone and brought it
maybe
back.
Or had it to like try to sell, or I don't know what the situation was with it, but I remember very vividly it being there, and he opened it, pulled it out, and he showed me what it looks like and how people use it. You know, this is a little scoop, and it was an educational experience because he wanted me to be exposed to it, so I understood that also he's my dad and he's doing something that's really important to him. Yeah. And it's, you know, trying to combat this thing. Right. And so it definitely made me respect his work and respect, those substances. And so, yeah, I was pretty mellow as a kid. I mean, I used to have, I mean, junior, senior in high school, quite a few beers, but
I feel like if I was cooler, I would have started drinking earlier. There was like one or two big parties that I went to in high school, but I remember the first time I had beer, I was playing a card game, just like a small card game with one of my friends, and I had 2 Bud Lights, and then my mom came to pick me up, and I remember standing up straight, waiting on the sidewalk for her to come, and trying to see how far I could lean over before I felt like that drunk buzzed feeling. And I was just like swinging, like if someone saw me, they probably would have thought I was like schizophrenic or something. I'm just like, whoa, just going around on the sidewalk like this. I'm like, oh, if I lean this way, I can feel it more. And, but yeah, I feel like what the experience that you had being exposed to just like the knowledge that harder drugs are out there early on is the better way to go, because I never had discussions with my parents outside of weed and alcohol. I never was exposed to anything that early on. And like the first time that I'm in a dorm room my sophomore year in college and someone pulls out cocaine, I'm like, my heart starts beating faster. I'm like, oh my, like I've only seen this in movies and
Right.
TV shows. Literally, like I know nothing about it. And just like that sort of fueled this just like this stereotypical view of what it mean, like what these drugs mean, what people like everyone who ever touches this is like a bad person, and like my parents never told me about this, so like everything must be bad, everything. And like it's if I was at least given the knowledge, whether it's in school or from my parents early on, that like, hey, this is out there, just so you know, like don't do it, but this is something that people do, and you'll probably see this in college, you'll probably see it living in New York City, and just be aware that it's there. I feel like I would have sort of accelerated my good relationship. I feel like I have a good relationship with alcohol and drugs now, rather than being like forced into it when I was 17, 18, be like, what the fuck is, like, I have no idea what anything is.
Right, not having the information. Yeah. And it brings up a good point about being open and communicating with your kids. Well, I have an 8-year-old daughter, and I try to be as open with her as possible about all of the experiences that I've had in life. Granted, I present them at the 8-year-old level as far as what I'm telling her, but I think it's really important to have those conversations, because I mean, in parallel to taking care of a child at the age they're at, I'm also trying to raise an educated and responsible adult at the same time. And so having that open communication is important, and I credit that to both of my parents, is just being open and talking about things.
Yeah. So you told me you left home when you were 18. Correct. To join the Marines. Mm-hmm. What drew you to enlist in the Marines?
Well, it was interesting because I have an older brother. He's 3 years older than I am, and he enlisted and left, right? Mm-hmm. And so
when he was 18 also?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And so I remember going to San Diego to his boot camp, graduation. And my dad kind of nudged me and said, when are you signing up? And I was just like thinking to myself, I'm not fucking signing up.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? But over time,
and you were like 15 at this time?
Yeah, I was probably 14 or 15. Yeah. And but then over time, I just saw my brother and I are very different. Not in any negative or positive way. We're just very different people. He's very analytical, he's an engineer. And I'm not so much like that. But I saw the confidence that it gave him and just the change in him. And it started to intrigue me a little bit more. But coming from a middle-class family, and we didn't have money for college, and what he had done was signed up for something called the Marine Corps College Fund, which gave him extra money for school after. And I realized, okay, I'm finishing 12 years of education. I'm like kind of over it right now.
Yeah.
I'm not ready to go to college, and I'm definitely not ready to incur hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans.
For sure.
So I went the same route, and I signed up and received the Marine Corps College Fund and went. Partially for that, but I was interested in what my brother was experiencing, and maybe I felt a little bit of pressure from even just that one comment. When
like
are
your
you
dad
going?
Nudged,
because he never pressured me at all. But subconsciously that enters your head, and you're just like, okay, is this what I'm supposed to do?
Yeah.
But I don't regret it at all. I had a really good experience, and I was able to pay for college without any debt after, and so it worked out really well.
So is the Marine Corps, when you're doing the college fund side of the Marine Corps, is that also 4 years, or what is that?
Yeah. Sometimes you have to. It depends on the contract you sign up for, but it's minimum 4 years for that.
And did you specify, or did you not specify? Did you specialize in anything while you were in the Marine Corps? Or is it just like basic training, like how to be a Marine?
So everybody has an MOS, which is like a military occupational specialty. Mm-hmm. And if you're in the infantry, you can be basic rifleman, mortarman, machine gunner. And so the entire Marine Corps has all these designations which tell you where you're going to go to school, what you're going to learn, and what your job's going to be within the military. Mm-hmm. And so I went open contract, but in the aviation support field because I was hoping to be like a crew member or a crew chief on one of the rotary wing aircraft. So like a helicopter or something like that.
So are you actually on the aircraft as the crew chief?
Well, that's what I wanted to do. It's not what I ended up doing, though.
Gotcha.
But that's what that you have the pilots, and then there's, I think, sometimes a crew of 2 or 3 people that are either unloading troops, unloading goods.
Gotcha.
But I wanted to be on a helicopter, I thought, and so I'm like, okay, I have, there's a chance. The specific job wasn't available, and I said, well, I asked my recruiter, what's the best way to do this? The open contract in the aviation support field. And so I ended up, it's kind of like a surprise after your combat training, because they're like, all right, this is what you get. And I ended up getting 7212, which is a Stinger missile gunner. So it's like,
that sounds sick.
it's like the opposite of being on an aircraft. It's shooting aircraft down.
Yeah.
And so so it was a combat specialty, and so that's what I got, and that's what I did for the 4 years.
So Stinger missile gunner, you would be on the ground, and then, like you said, if an aircraft was coming over your space, you would be in charge of shooting them down.
Correct. It's there's a couple of different systems, and this one is low altitude air defense, and so it has a maximum range, and it's deployable in a couple of different ways now, but one is called man pads, which is man portable, so you just fire it from your shoulder. And then we had also something called the Avenger weapon system. It's basically a turret mounted on the back of a Humvee, and it rotates, and it has 2 missile pods that on each side that hold 4 missiles. And so you're in there kind of rotating.
So you have bullets and missiles, in the same pod, in the same gun.
So we had the missile pods, and then below one of the missile pods, we had a 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the side for like even closer range aircraft. So there's limitations to the missile, and so if they're too close, you have to go to the 50 caliber. And like hope. But yeah.
Shooting that must make you feel like God. Like I couldn't imagine shooting a turret at full go.
Yeah, it was interesting. The shoulder fired version was the most interesting because you have this missile that weighs, between 30 and 40 pounds on your shoulder, and you shoot it, and it has a launch motor that launches it out a certain distance before the flight motor kicks in, because if the flight motor kicked in immediately, it would burn you.
Yeah. Gotcha.
And so you have this thing on your shoulder, and it goes from 30 to 40 pounds to like 3 in an instant,
Wow. And
so it's light on your shoulder, and then you watch it go. And it's an interesting system. It has basically a gyro on the front of the missile, so it can track the aircraft. And then when you fire it, it goes to a predetermined location where it's going to meet the aircraft. It doesn't chase the aircraft. So
okay, so the heat seeking that you see in Mission Impossible, it wasn't that. Like it had to be in line with the trajectory of the aircraft.
Right. And so I think you would definitely have the infrared lock on it. So it would still have the heat signature, but it had the ability to navigate to meet that heat signature.
Is that a real world thing? The type of stuff you see in the movies where the plane is moving all over the place and the missile is locked onto it, moving, as tight as an F-16 fighter jet. Like, is that something that could actually happen, or is that just all in movies?
I don't think I can't speak to that because I don't know about like the weapon systems that they have on the aircraft and what they are or aren't able to do. But there are definitely moments with the Stinger missile where you miss for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Maybe you won't have a good heat signature, or something will happen, and then it just spirals up into the sky, and eventually it'll explode up there. Has a time limit on it. But yeah, that's what I did, and it wasn't what I wanted to do, but I'm really glad I did it because I was able to travel and meet some really good folks.
Yeah.
My horse got out.
Oh yeah, we got some horses joining us on the podcast off camera. We got another dog. What did you say her name was again?
This is Saboya.
Saboya.
Yeah, Onion.
Saboya and Badger.
Onion and Badger.
What's up, guys? Maybe I'll get a few more mics for the horses. So where were you stationed during your time in the Marines? Because you
So
mentioned you traveled a bit
yeah,
while you were enlisted.
so I was originally stationed in Camp Pendleton, north of San Diego, California,
Yeah.
and while I was there attached to 3rd Low Altitude Air Defense Battalion, I was fortunate enough to be selected to be a part of a small detachment that was with the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit.
Mm.
And so a Marine Expeditionary Unit is a unit that usually trains for about a year leading to the deployment. And so you get these different units from all across the Marine Corps that become attached to this amphibious deployment on naval vessels. And so we do these workups out in the ocean off the coast of San Diego, and we do like long range helicopter raids, amphibious deployments to attack beachheads and things like that in training. To go on the deployment, which is a 6-month tour around the world up into the Persian Gulf.
Mm.
And so essentially what a Marine
Is that the Middle East?
Mhm,
Kind of
that's
like all
like
those countries up?
yeah, so the
Okay.
Persian Gulf is right there where the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, all of
Okay.
those areas there. And Iran's on one side.
And that was the actual deployment, that arc, or that was training to deploy somewhere?
Well, so during that time, I did that deployment in 1999. So that
Okay.
was prior to 2001 when everything changed. But that deployment was a part of what they called Operation Southern Watch. So it was something that had come at the end of the first war in Iraq.
Mm.
And so there were constant deployments and overlaps of rotations to the Persian Gulf in case anything kind of happened again.
Mm.
And so the whole training was to go there. And then we did training operations in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But also the Marine Expeditionary Unit is there on deployment for humanitarian reasons too. So while we were out there, there was an earthquake in East Timor. I believe it was an earthquake. I'll have to go back and see. Anyway, there was a humanitarian issue in East Timor in Indonesia. And so one of the ships went there to provide assistance. And so we're just out in the ocean, and it's like the first force to go if something kind of pops off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on the day-to-day, what does that look like? Like, is it banging down doors? Is it more like like operations watching? Like, what did it feel like on the day-to-day?
Well, on the ship, it was pretty mundane, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not a whole lot you can do while you're underway. The training was the leading up to that. And
Okay.
then when we were on the ship, we had our vehicles on the ship in the well deck. And so the well deck is essentially, we were on the USS Ogden, and it's an LPD-5. And essentially it has this big gate on the back of the ship that opens up, and it can lower its ballast and sink the whole back of the ship into the ocean.
Oh,
and so
damn.
amphibious vehicles can come and go off of the ramp inside the ship into the
Wow.
ocean and go. So being that the back of the ship was open and all of our vehicles are made out of metal and fiberglass,
Yeah.
inevitably we had tons of rust. So
Yeah.
so I remember hours and hours of busting rust off of everything
Yeah.
while we were underway.
Were you in the Marines when 9/11 happened, or were you out before that?
I got out in May of 2001.
Oh, wow.
And I was already in college when that happened.
When you were still in the Marines that earlier that year in 2001, did you notice were there any signs being in the Middle East that 9/11 was happening, or like something was happening, or I don't know if people above you started acting differently? Like, was there anything that you would say like, oh, that was weird looking back on it? Or was it just, 9/11 happened and then that's when the flip
I didn't
happened?
notice anything in the years leading up to that. I mean, that area has been an area of interest for the longest time, so I'm sure, I mean, and everything's, I was a sergeant, and so I was like a troop leader at the platoon level. And so that compartmentalization of like not getting all of the information, maybe there was information on a higher level, way higher level that was there. I mean, but we definitely got briefs on terrorism, and things like that. But there was nothing. I mean, and when you're in the Marine Corps, you're constantly training for
Yeah.
whatever, and so there wasn't anything that was like, okay, all of a sudden we're issued desert camouflage,
Yeah.
you know.
And
Only
like
for
something's up.
yeah, only for the deployment we were issued everything, desert camo and all of that stuff. It was like a whole different thing. But because we had a destination, we knew where we were going.
Were there any days or any missions that were particularly jarring that you can talk about, or does it all kind of just blend together into one deployment?
Well, I mean, there was in the workups. I mean, I was fortunate. I think I'd probably be a different person today if my deployments would have been post 9/11.
Yeah.
I definitely, and I'll get to your question in a second. I definitely had like some guilt when that happened because I had just gotten out and I knew people that were gearing up to go, and I had trained 4 years, and at the point of my departure, I was like one of the most experienced at the platoon level of a lot of. I mean, there is a group of us, but most experienced as far as what our training had been, because our detachment on the expeditionary unit was was 10 people. So us 10 people going back to what they call the fleet, to the regular units, got that experience. And there was a handful of others that were on different deployments like that. So I felt guilty a little bit that people were going.
Were any of your friends that got out when you got out, were they going back into the Marines because of 9/11?
I don't know anybody who did. No, but I had friends who I served with that had already re-enlisted, who went during the initial invasion in Iraq. And I talked to a couple of them after, and one of them didn't make it. He died within the first, I think, 3 days of the initial invasion. But yeah, I mean, I think probably the people who got out kind of struggled with that a little bit to a certain degree. But I guess your question was, so I didn't see any of that.
Yeah.
But training for something like this, especially when we're training to be special operations qualified to be able to do these special missions, you train hard. You train like the real thing, right?
Yeah.
And so I remember one instance where we had gone on some long range helo raid off of the ship. So we're on the ship, we get on these helicopters and we go off into central California, sometimes as far as Arizona, and do an op and then come back to the ship. And I remember this one evening we came back and it was stormy, and we were on a CH-46, which is the double rotor helicopter.
Yeah.
And we came into the ship and all you could see was this like little light on the ship. Like, it seemed like to me, I was looking out the window, like one little light bulb, and the ship, you could see we'd get low and the ship is pitching and the helicopter is like trying to figure out how to land. And it seemed like an eternity. And I think that moment stuck with me because it was quite hairy. It was like, I was nervous, but also because the deployment previous to us, a helicopter came in a lot easier conditions, and there's a net around the landing platform on the deck, and part of the landing gear got stuck in the net, and same type of helicopter and everything flipped over, and a bunch of Marines drowned right there in training. So you take the training seriously, that things can happen. But at the same time, I mean, I think those experiences, especially with the people that you're with, build a bond and a camaraderie that's hard to find elsewhere, and like it's interesting because you go through these situations that, I mean, it's like they say, embrace the suck. Like it's not fun. But like there's always so much humor involved as well. It's like it sucks for everybody, but you're always just poking fun and laughing and joking about it. So it's kind of this balance between, this is kind of serious, but at the same time it's hilarious.
It's funny how embrace the suck can have so many different levels, because you're saying it to keep you focused as you're literally preparing for war and people are dying in training. And my embrace the suck is doing, another sprint in college baseball where I'm like, I can get through this.
Right.
If I don't do this, I'm not going to be able to travel to St. Louis this weekend to play.
Right.
And I'm just like, but yeah, I mean, I've never been through anything like what you're describing. So it's just interesting to hear. And you also seem like a pretty chill guy that can, like, things that might rattle myself or someone else who has an average temperament. It seems like you would be able to handle that a little bit better in the moment, where it's like still scary, but you seem like you could kind of dissolve the scariness of the situation and just act in what you're supposed to do, which I guess is what the Marines train you to do.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that when you go to boot camp, you realize right then that there are people from every walk of life in there in your platoon, you know, and the idea is that they tear you down to build you back up into to what they want you to be. And I mean, that's the reason why it's happening at 18 years old. You know, our brains aren't fully developed. We're very, very malleable. And yeah, I think that's the whole goal of Marine Corps recruit training, combat training, is to do that. Not everybody has that temperament, but they can learn how to you know, go through these things and not freak out.
Are there a lot of people that drop out of boot camp?
Very few. It's kind of hard to.
Because I guess you're contractually obligated to make it through.
And so there were a few that left, and there were some people who tried to like escape in the middle of the night. Man, I don't know where they thought they were going. They
tried to escape. And this
like
was
prison break.
Was this in the Persian Gulf, or was this still back in the U.S.?
This was in boot camp.
Okay.
Yeah. Like they're like, oh, I don't think this is what I wanted.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not liking this. So like we had recruits that were trying to escape every once in a while, and of course they're going to get caught. We're on a secure military installation, and it's like this little skinny 18-year-old with a shaved head running around.
Was this in Oregon, or is this in a different state?
This was in I went to recruit training in Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, California.
In San Diego, okay.
Yeah. And
so they just thought they'd sneak past the fucking guards that are there.
The brilliant thing about where that recruit depot is located is it's literally shares a fence with the San Diego International Airport. So all day long when you're training, you're seeing people come and go. Yeah. And you're stuck.
Damn. That's gotta drive the nail harder to be like, you're here. You gotta make it through. So if you did escape, wouldn't the military come after you? Because you've signed the contract. You're I forget, there's a name for it, right? Not desertion, but like going AWOL or something. Like the military.
Sorry to talk over you.
No, you're good. I was just gonna say you're not military property, but like you signed a paper that obligates you to work for the military. So I think they'd come after you.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, essentially, I think we all considered ourselves military property at that point.
True.
So yeah, I mean, they're not necessarily going to send people out looking for you, but you're going to show up eventually, and you're going to have some sort of discharge, whether it be bad conduct discharge or dishonorable discharge, and you don't want that on your record for the rest of your life. It makes it difficult to get a decent job in the civilian world. So I think that was a deterrent for a lot. But I mean, there were other people who deserted, just in certain different points. Usually not like it was in the beginning. It was like during the initial training before you got to your unit that most of that happened. Yeah,
where they're just like, this is not for me.
Yeah,
I fucked up.
And it happened a couple times with people that I knew, and it always comes back to them.
Yeah. I have to ask you, because I've had a few other guys on the podcast. One was a commercial pilot, and a couple other were like F-16 pilots, and they said that they've had UFO experiences, and they didn't attribute it to any specific source, but they were like, I saw weird shit in the sky, and like, this is what happened, and we never figured out what it was. So by definition, it was a UFO or UAP, they call it now. Did you ever see anything weird having been on a ship? Because I know that's where a lot of those sightings happen, or or talked to any guys who have said they've seen something weird in the sky that they weren't able to attribute the source to?
Well, the interesting thing about being on the ship is that we weren't usually out on deck after a certain time of the day. So when it's dark and you're out there, I mean, people usually aren't out there. So I didn't see anything. I saw just weird stuff in the middle of the ocean, but it was all natural, like different fish and different things like that. But I did see something interesting, and I don't know what it was still, but we were doing a training operation in Southern California in Camp Pendleton, and there was some weird stuff happening in the sky. I don't know what it was still, but it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before.
What did it look like?
It was like, bright light, and bright light moving through the sky. And it was kind of like Southern California has something they call the marine layer that kind of rolls in off the ocean. And it usually comes in a certain distance inland. And then the farther inland you go, it's nice and clear. So it was a night, we were out all night, and I was in a fighting hole in this position, and I was looking up at the sky, and there was just some weird glow that looked, it was inexplicable to me, but it was kind of obstructed by the marine layer. But It wasn't like, it didn't resonate with me as like it was an aircraft flying or something. It was just like this, it looked like fire in the sky.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I don't know what it was. It could have been anything. It could have been like some meteor that was coming in, and like, I don't know. But
it wasn't like it's something, was it something in the paper the next day, or military exercise, something like that? Or it just was, it looked like a fire, and then it was just like whatever that was.
Yeah, it was like, that's weird. I wonder what that is. And then like moving on.
Yeah. So after the Marines, you went to University of Oregon to get into archaeology. Mm-hmm. Why archaeology? What drew you to archaeology?
Well, it's a good question. I went to the university not having any idea what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I
still have no idea what I want to do. I'm hoping this works out. So
it seems like it's going to work out.
Yeah.
That's something that I've always been curious about, how at 18 years old or 20 years old or 24 years old, you're supposed to know what you're going to do with the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. And so when I went to college, I just got all my general requisites out of the way. And can you guys stop chasing the horse?
We got some...
Hey, enough. Badger, come here.
Some horse dogfight action going on.
So I didn't really know what I was going to do. And so I took a bunch of different classes to see what kind of stuck. And I liked anthropology, and I ended up meeting somebody through that same friend that drove down here with me, Peter. He was a couple years ahead of me because I had joined the military, but we were the same age. And he had taken a class at a satellite campus for the University of Oregon because he was in ski patrol. And so when he'd do ski patrol during the winter, he'd take classes at the satellite campus. And he took a class from a gentleman named George Wasson, who was a Native American guy who taught this class called Native North Americans. He's an anthropologist. And so George happened to be from Eugene, where the main campus was. And they both came back to Eugene for the last term that year. And I was introduced to George, and he was just this really interesting character. And he kind of became my mentor as far as anthropology goes. And I really started getting into the study of humans, and I was really interested in his stories because he was an oral traditionalist. So he told a lot of stories, but he was this really interesting guy because he was in his 70s. And he's just like jolly guy. It reminded me of Buddha a little bit, like the classic iconology of Buddha, but a super nice guy. And he'd always have us over and just feed us unlimited amounts of gin and tonic and cook ribeye steaks and just talk.
That's a good time.
Yeah. And so towards the end of I knew that time, like just in having these one-on-ones with him, that it was something that was really interesting to me. And so I decided to go the route of anthropology and then focus in archaeology. And he was kind of one of the guys who helped me along. Yeah.
And so that's a bachelor's degree it's like a dual degree in archaeology and anthropology, or
So
how does that work?
anthropology has a couple of different routes you can go. It's a bachelor's degree, it's an undergrad degree, and you could either be a physical anthropologist, which is somebody who's maybe studying the physical remains of people.
Mm.
Then you can have a cultural anthropologist who is just studying certain cultures. An archaeologist who is studying mankind through material remains that are left behind.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple of different branches you can go, and so archaeology was something that I was interested in. And I think even from before, maybe just watching Indiana Jones.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the whole baseball thing was from watching fucking like Kenny Powers a lot when I was in high school. I was like, I want to, be major leagues and bang bitches, make a lot of money. And just like the seeing that on film, seeing that on TV definitely marks you when you're a kid.
Back to Danny McBride.
Exactly. Yeah. I've always bring it back to Danny McBride.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was interesting to me at that point. And I was like, you know what, this is something that I can do. I knew from the very beginning, like as soon as I became a young adult, I knew I never wanted to have an office job. Yeah. I knew I couldn't handle it. It's just not my personality. And so archaeology was the type of thing where I could be out and I could explore and discover things, and it seemed like it'd be a pretty good fit for me.
Yeah. Do you feel, because in archaeology you're like a detective for humankind, like you're figuring out the past. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like your dad being a detective has influenced you to get into archaeology, that curiosity to figure out what happened, like even if it's not on a day-to-day case level where you're like, I want to stick my hands into something physically and figure out like what the hell happened here?
Yeah, maybe not necessarily his career, but I think maybe both of my parents just encouraging curiosity.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't really have a clear answer of why I ended up there. It just seemed the right fit, but I definitely do have a healthy curiosity, and it comes from just how I was raised and being allowed to explore.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I can't, like I said, I can't really attribute it to his career, but it's definitely there, the curiosity.
And how long were you working as an archaeologist?
So, I think to be technically called an archaeologist in the academic field, you have to have a master's degree, do a thesis, and then typically in academics, you go on to get your PhD. And so I went a different route to where I just went straight into the workforce, and I was kind of like somebody who's out recording sites and doing excavations and stuff. But I did it for several years. I worked... the first job I worked was for the Forest Service, which was in Alaska on the Kenai Peninsula. And then I came back down to Oregon and worked for a private firm for a while. And I just wasn't into the private sector.
Yeah.
And then I went back to the Forest Service. And when I eventually moved to Panama, I was working for the Forest Service again in Central Oregon.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. So what is the private sector's interest in archaeology? I'm trying to think like what they would view as, because it's always about profit, right?
Yes, exactly. And so whenever you have some public works project, you have to have an archaeologist assessment of the project to make sure that there's nothing there. And so let's just say, for example, a highway on ramp, off ramp.
Gotcha.
Right. So they want to put one in somewhere. They have to contract with a company that'll come out and do an archaeological assessment to make sure that there isn't anything going to be disturbed. And if there is going to be something disturbed, that they can do a proper data recovery on that site to get as much information as they can before the project proceeds. And so in the private sector, those guys are bidding different jobs that are usually, I would imagine most of them are paid for by the government. And so they go out and do the work, and then...
And they call you in and they say, can you sign off that there's nothing likely to be dug up
exactly
here?
So you have to
stuff like that, archaeologically interesting.
They compile a report from what I believe, and then they send it to the state archaeologist, so they have all of that those signatures of like, we've done the proper assessment. This is what we found.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Did you ever go on one of those jobs and you found that there was something there and
Oh, yeah.
that, you can't dig here because, I don't know, there's mammoth bones or something like that?
Well,
Like,
so it was more like archaeology being the study of humans. It was mostly, just anything relating to human occupation. And so, I was involved in data recovery projects where in areas that were well known as huge trade centers. One in particular in a place called the Dalles, Oregon, which is right on the Columbia River, which is a massive river that is the border between Oregon State and Washington State. And so we knew we were going to find stuff there. And this was a project for, I think it was a development for a hotel or something like that. And so we went and we found all sorts of things. I mean, once you're digging down, you find the cultural layer, which you can see that the dirt looks different. Yeah. You can dig down through the first couple layers, you don't see anything, and then all of a sudden when you get to the cultural layer, you see everything looks different.
What's different about the cultural layer from the regular dirt?
The color, the objects that you find in it, it's just different. You can just tell that
someone's
lived
here at some point.
This was the period of time where humans were here.
Gotcha.
And so we did that, and then on that particular, project, inevitably you had to go through and separate lithics, which are small pieces of stone that they were like maybe flint knapping and little pieces that would come off the stone. We'd separate those from bone, from wood, from charcoal as we're going down. Yeah. And so with bone, sometimes we would find human remains, and then at that point the tribe would have to come out and do a cleansing ceremony on us. And so they would burn sage and sing and cleanse us of the spirits of whoever that ancestor was. So
gotcha.
So we did find things of that nature for sure.
Was the cleansing was that more of a superstitious thing, or was that out of a respect for whoever passed away, or a combination?
I think it's part of the tribe's spirituality.
Okay, yeah, gotcha.
And I mean, I wouldn't call it a religion, but their spirituality and what they need to do when you disturb a gravesite.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Are there any digs that stand out to you in particular when you look back on your time as an archaeologist? Well,
so interestingly enough, the majority of my time I spent working for the Forest Service, and it was less about data recovery, which is when you do a dig. It was more about surface survey. So for example, when you're in the Forest Service and you're working on these national forests, it's a similar situation where if they want to come in and do what they call a fuels reduction project, where they need to come in and thin the trees out, or do a logging. I mean, let's be honest, the Forest Service is logging trees and selling them for revenue as well. But every time they did that, you'd have to go through and survey a plot of land to try to record any sites and then flag them off to where when the other entities within the Forest Service came in to do their work, they wouldn't disturb it. And so in Alaska, what we were working on was historical archaeology. So it was basically prehistoric and historic archaeology, and historic archaeology dealing more with like the gold rush and the mining.
Gotcha.
And so we would hike in.
What was that, like 200-300 years ago?
Yeah,
gold rush?
So it's the 1800s.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we would hike into these remote cabin sites where they'd have a mine, and we'd record the site, and we'd do that for mine mitigation. So the eventual closure of the actual hole in the ground, because it was a safety hazard.
Gotcha.
And so that was the kind of stuff that we would do there, which was really fun because, Alaska is an amazing place, and we worked 4 10-hour days, and we were in the backcountry. So we'd leave Monday morning, we'd hike back into the backcountry, and we'd do our work. And then Thursday afternoon, we'd hike back out. And then I'd have 3-day weekends to just recreate wherever in that area. Yeah.
So you had the nature, obviously, the relaxation, the unwinding built into the actual job.
For sure. I mean, it wasn't always relaxing because in that area there are some big bears.
Oh, yeah.
So when I
That's just me being from New York, where it's like I mean, the
beautiful.
bears aren't gonna do anything, and then you go out west and you're like, yeah, they'll fucking
no,
do something.
that was. I mean, there was something we call paranoia, and I would recreate alone quite often. I'd go for a hike or I'd go fishing or something, and like every sound was like, what was that?
And you have that, having grown up in a lot of that, you still have that paranoia.
Well, I think like just seeing your first bear and realize, like brown bear especially, or grizzly, you realize what they are, and then you have the paranoia, and then like
it started after your first personal bear sighting, like when you came face to face with a bear.
I mean, I think if you do any research on what brown bears or grizzlies are capable of, it's kind of immediately puts that into you, especially if you know you're going into their environment.
Yeah.
So I think it was one of those things. But I'd worked in Alaska twice, and the first time I went up there just to work a summer job, and that was my first encounter with grizzlies. And you have a healthy respect when you see one in the wild, and so that paranoia was quite present. And then also there on the Kenai Peninsula, I ran into several different bears, and it's a tense thing because you know that they're not like black bears, where black bears will usually just run away from you. Yeah, they do not care. Yeah,
the brown bears, grizzly bears,
they don't care, and like they're the boss.
So what do you do in a situation where, because I've heard like you see it online, or you see memes, or just these bullet point lists of what you're supposed to do with a bear encounter. But like you said, there's the black bears, there's the brown bears. I've never actually had a bear encounter myself, so this is all just theoretical to me. So, and that's also probably why I sound dumb asking questions about it. But like, what did you do in those situations when you encountered the brown bears and grizzly bears? And was that what you were supposed to do?
maybe not in every occasion. I did what I was supposed to do. There was one time where there's this kind of famous place on the Kenai Peninsula called the Russian River, and the salmon runs come through there, every summer, and it's just like crazy. And they've built all of these aluminum walkways along the river because it's become quite world famous, and people go and they'll fish there, and it becomes a zoo. Yeah. But because the sun goes down so late there during the summer, I would go and I'd fish at 1:00 in the morning, and it'd still be sunny. Not sunny, but it'd be light. And so you would avoid those crowds. And but I have friends that are from Alaska that I met in college, and they had a cabin right near that place, and I had keys to their cabin, and I'd always go stay there even though they weren't there. And so they had told me stories about attacks that had happened at this place. And there's one guy in particular, a couple of years previously, had gotten chased down by a bear on the boardwalk area and got his face ripped off.
Oh, Jesus.
And so like you hear those stories, just like we were talking about earlier about, you hear the stories that travel are the ones of horror.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're the ones that stick with you. And so like that in your brain, when you're around these animals, you're like, man, I don't want that to happen to me.
Yeah.
But when we were there fishing, I mean, there's bears all through there, and they come down to eat the fish as well. And there was a younger bear walking, just these people. I was out in the water, and this bear the people walked by on the boardwalk, and I just kind of said hi to them. And then maybe a minute later, they came walking back, and they just like had this look on their face, like they were different when they went that way. They just
seen some shit.
And they just said, there's a bear. And I said, just come out here and get in the water with me. And I looked, and so the boardwalk wasn't wide, and the bear was coming this way, and they were going this way. They're like, oh. Yeah. And so I just had him come out in the water, and I said, just be really calm and just let him do his thing. We'll keep talking so he knows we're here. And there was this little like net barrier against the edge, and he got to that, and he just like pushed it over and jumped in the water and waded across the water and went and started eating a dead fish on the other side of the beach. So he wasn't really worried about us because they're exposed to so many people, but that's also a scary thing. Like when does it get to the point where there's like, I'm tired of you.
Yeah.
You know, this is my fish or whatever.
Yeah.
Or maybe you have an unstable bear or something.
Yeah, it's unpredictable.
Sure.
You never know if it's going to snap.
So in that instance, I mean, I felt pretty calm. In another, just up the road, I was at my friend's cabin, and they happened to be there, he and his brother. And I went out, and I was sitting on this little swing that they have outside their house. You have to hike up from the road to their cabin, and there's one spot where you could get cell service, and I'm on my little tiny Nokia phone from back then, you know, and I made a call back to Oregon to my girlfriend at the time, and I'm sitting on the swing and talking on the phone, and the swing was just slowly spinning. I spun around, and there's this massive brown bear.
Holy shit.
Yeah, within probably 40 yards of me, which is pretty close. And it's just walking towards me. And I was just like, all I said to her was on the phone, I said, "Oh shit, bear." And I just hung up, and she's probably like, what the
Well, I guess I'll find out if he's alive in 5 minutes.
So in that moment, like, I got off the swing, and I didn't like, that was a moment of panic to me because it surprised me. Like, the other place I knew there were bears around, but this guy was walking right towards me.
Yeah. And I'm sure you're also slightly dizzy from spinning on the swing. So you're like, not only is there a bear there, but I'm kind of uncoordinated at the moment as I'm dealing with a bear.
Well, and then the tunnel vision kind of like everything closing in on you, because you realize it's that fight or flight instinct kicks in, and it's like, I can't fight.
Yeah.
You know,
and everything tells you not to run.
Yeah.
And under any circumstance, do not run from a bear. I think that's the same with black bears and brown bears.
Yeah. And so what I did at that moment, I started walking slowly away from it, but it was quite a climb to get up to the cabin. It was up higher. And when I realized that it wasn't really focused on me, it was still looking around. Then when I got a certain distance, I bolted into the cabin.
Yeah.
And my friends didn't believe me. They were in there cooking, and maybe the bear smelt the food. Because this was in the morning. And I was like, there's a huge fucking brown bear out there. And they're like, what? Because they've had that cabin in their family for decades, and they'd never seen one there. They're around, but not on their property.
Even with the stories by the boardwalk and everything,
yeah, I
they
mean,
didn't
that's just down the river, but the bears
Yeah.
are usually along the riverbank fishing that time of year, and they just never seen one on their property.
Yeah.
And so my friend Travis and his brother Todd, they're like native Alaskans, you know, so they like do a lot of hunting, and Todd always has this really nice camera with a zoom lens. So he popped out and got some really cool photos of the bear, which I still have.
Oh, nice.
So it's a nice memory, but it just walked up behind this log and sat down and just put its massive pop on the log and just kind of soaked up the sun.
And it looked like it was just, you know, a white girl looking at the sunset with a glass of Chardonnay.
Yeah, it definitely was non-aggressive, which was nice. But I mean, it's just being in the presence of something that you know could destroy you in an instant if it wanted to. It just gives you a different feeling.
What time of year was it?
It was the summer, so that had to have been maybe July.
Okay, gotcha. I this could be completely wrong, but I've heard that when it's the summertime, bears can be more chill, but once they start to hibernate, if you see a bear that's out during the winter, like usually it's starving or is not thinking correctly because it should be hibernating.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing, and I think there was recently an attack in Montana where it was pretty brutal, where it killed a couple who were avid hikers, and they weren't expecting any bears to be in the area, and they were able to send out an SOS through their phone to family members saying that they were being attacked. And it was very brief text messages, but by the time a rapid response team was deployed to the area, they had both been killed. And it was a bear that was hungry, and it didn't have enough calories for the winter.
Yeah, it's kind of just wandering around. So, sorry, what
have
were
you
you going to
seen
say?
Grizzly Man? Have you seen Grizzly Man?
No, I haven't.
Man, you gotta watch it.
Is it it's a documentary, right? About a guy who lived with grizzlies. Okay.
Werner Herzog.
I've heard about it.
Yeah. No, and that gives you some insight into the behavior of these animals, you know. And
I'm gonna write that down so I remember.
Yeah,
I
can write it down for you after. Grizzly Man, and the guy was he was an eclectic character to be going out and doing this.
Yeah.
But he met his maker.
Yeah.
In the form of a hungry bear that was probably didn't have enough calories.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen the documentary, so open myself to sort of freeing myself from expectation. But you got to think that if a guy who's living with bears, if he ends up getting killed by bears, like in that moment, he's got to be like, this is exactly what I asked for. Like, this is how I asked to go.
Yeah, I'll let you watch the documentary.
Yeah.
It's hard to ascertain from the guy's behavior what was going on in his mind.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And sorry, I kind of spoiled it for you, but
no. I heard that just through the zeitgeist of this documentary about a guy who lived with bears and ended up, coming full circle. So but it sounds fascinating. So I'm gonna check it out either way.
Yeah, his footage is incredible, and it's a really neat documentary. But it has its touches of humor, just like how it's put together.
Yeah,
because the guy was a character, but
yeah. So what brought you down to the land of less bears in Panama, or no bear? There are no bears down here, right?
No,
or
not that I know of.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and that's the question that I often get every time I meet somebody, and it's an interesting question because there are definitely some decisions that I made that that made it all happen. But at the same time, I think like the way we arrive to the present is like a culmination of many decisions that we've made along our life, and I just feel like almost like there were a bunch of decisions that seemed insignificant at the time that kind of led me to here. But I knew like when I was working up in the US, I felt like I was kind of like a square peg being shoved into a round hole. I didn't really understand. I didn't get the concept. I had like great opportunities, and I could have, stayed with the Forest Service. I had job opportunities, and retired in probably 10 years from now.
Do you mean professionally you feel like you were a square peg, or every aspect of life, professionally, socially?
Well,
you just wanted to escape?
Yeah, I just wanted to escape. I didn't understand working in one place for 30 years and then retiring and living the golden years.
Yeah.
I just couldn't wrap my head around it. And every time I'd get into a career that was something that was good, I'd just be like, yeah, but do I really want to do this for like 30 years?
Yeah.
And I just kind of realized that it wasn't for me. And so I was actually working. A lot of times you work seasonally when you do that kind of work, archaeology, because when the snow falls, you can't do any surface surveys. And so I was off for the winter, and I came down here, and it was my second trip down here. I'd come originally in early 2006 and had met people that I still know today. And I'd come back down for a visit. And at that point, I was just like, I think I just want to live a different lifestyle.
Yeah.
And it was partially because of, one of the things that really bothered me, and it might seem like very minimal or silly, but every time I would meet somebody, it seemed like, hi, what's your name? What do you do?
Yeah. What do you do
and it
for
was
work?
A pet peeve of mine to where I couldn't get away from it. And I was like, man, if everybody seems to attach their identity to what their career is, and like, I'm a person, I don't know what I want to do with my life. And I just want to go somewhere where that's not the second question out of somebody's mouth.
Yeah. So a lot of times it's the first question, especially in New York. What do you do? What's your name? They decide if they want to know you based on
exactly.
what
can you do for me? Yeah. And so some of these things, I think were part of the catalyst that made me want to live a different life. But I also, it goes back to that sense of adventure and trying something new, and also having the I don't want to call it courage, but having the wherewithal to look at an option and say, you know what, fuck it, I'm just going to do it, you know, and not be afraid of what the outcome is. And I'm really happy I did. It ebbs and flows, there have been moments through my entire 16 years here where I've just been like, maybe I should go back, but then I talk myself out of that really quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a beautiful place to live, and now that I have a daughter, I wouldn't want to raise her anywhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that sentiment makes sense about the whole corporate dream being dead, because for my generation and the generations below me, I just turned 30. That I don't think any of my friends have the intuition that I'm going to work for a company for 20 or 30 years and then they're going to support me on the back end. There's no company loyalty anymore both ways. Companies see you as disposable, and then as a human being, you want to do what you want to do, and if that is outside of what the company offers, then you're just going to go pursue that. And that's part of the reason that I got into podcasting, was that once my dream of baseball died, I thought about, is there a job out there that's already preset where I can just come in and be a mold, and that's going to fulfill me for, 2-3 decades. And I didn't find a job out there that was going to do that. And I still have a day job that pays the bills, but I'm slowly building up the podcasting business. And it's been, such a joy, shout out to you and your farm living here for the past 3 weeks. I definitely feel that aspect of the spark to travel more and experience more and live in more places, especially once, I work remotely. So it's not that I'm not tied to an office anymore anyway, but like just having that ability to travel and work from a place for a month, and if my girlfriend gets assigned somewhere for 6 months, I'm like, all right, well, as long as they have decent Wi-Fi, I can come join you. I definitely feel that spirit of, once I get outside of the US or get outside of New York, and that sort of, like, it's cliche, but that hustle mentality, then my brain feels like it actually starts to change being outside of that environment. Like, I don't necessarily think about my job as much. It's still important to me to do it well, but it's, I'm not thinking about it 70, 80 hours a week. I'm thinking about it when I'm doing it. And then when I'm outside, it's impossible to think about it, because there's, I'm so much more at peace. I'm so much more at rest. So I commend you for making the decision and following through with it. Not that obviously you don't need my approval, but like, it's very inspiring to see someone build a farm from scratch over the last 16 years. You showed me a photo of what it was before this, and it's literally just hills and grass.
Yeah,
you had an arrow pointing to where this Airbnb is now. And again, I'll put up some photos on the video version of the podcast, but it's literally a hill with an arrow pointing to it, and everything on this farm you've built over the last decade and a half. So that's very inspiring, and that's awesome.
I appreciate your words, and it's interesting because I never set out to inspire anybody. I just do what I like to do, and there's something rewarding about being self-sufficient and learning these tools, or having these tools and learning these skills to be able to take care of yourself. And you have to be that way in a place like this. If everybody could see what the landscape looks like. I mean, we're in the middle of nowhere, and 16 years ago, it was a lot more difficult. And that's like the biggest barrier that I see for other people who come down here, because over the years there have been a lot more foreigners coming in and trying to do similar things, and I can kind of look at somebody and tell, you might make it, you're definitely not gonna make it. And along the way there are so many complaints, because it's challenging at times, but it's rewarding. But the complaints, I'm just like, come on, you don't even, 16 years ago, you would have lasted a couple of days. We have all sorts of things within our reach now. But it's interesting to start with something that is basically a blank canvas, and just learn what you need to learn to be able to build something for yourself. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I were in a job for the last 16 years working, giving all of my time to somebody else. You know? And so I just kind of flipped the coin, and I don't have to make money to be able to pay the plumber to come fix my leak,
Yeah.
or I don't have to make money to make the electrician come and do something. I learned all of those things myself. And so you can live a more simple lifestyle and be able to take care of all of your needs on your
absolutely.
own.
So I think a good way to end off, because I'm sure there are a lot of people listening to this and watching this that will hear what you're saying and hear the story of you making the decision to just say, fuck it, I'm going to move down to Panama and build a farm. But they have blockages in their own life, whether it's they're used to a certain lifestyle, making a certain amount of money from their job. Maybe they can't work remotely. Maybe they have preconceptions about living outside the US or living outside wherever they're from. What advice would you have to someone who senses that deep down their ultimate desire is to build a life? Maybe not, it's not exactly the same as living on a farm and building it from scratch, but something that's entirely different from the life that they had projected for themselves maybe 5 years ago, and they're starting to feel a lot differently. What advice would you have for someone who wants to make a drastic change for the better, but is not really sure how to get there, how to manifest it?
I think one of the most beautiful things in life is our ability to make decisions. And so just because you make a decision doesn't mean you can't make another decision, right?
Mhm.
And so, I think that's probably a big barrier for people because, they're worried about whether it's the right decision. Well, what are the implications of me making this decision and moving abroad for a certain amount of time? But that's the beauty of it. If you move abroad and it doesn't work out, at least you did it,
Yeah.
and you can make a decision to go somewhere else or go back. And so I would think that it would be important to not forget that, nothing's permanent. You can always move on. And, it's very cliche to say, but you're going to regret the things you don't do rather
Mhm.
than the things that you do,
Yeah.
especially, and it's always been something that I found really important is to listen to people who were much older in life, like, towards the end of their life, and listen to the things that they have to say.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be there, and so if I can avoid some regret by taking this wisdom from them,
Yeah.
then I'm going to do it. And so I think that's something that's important to remember is that, you can do it. And if you don't like it, you can make another decision and change.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point too. You can't regret the things that you can't do. Like it's better, or you can't regret the things that you don't do. It's better to fuck up, and even if it's not the right decision, at some point it's going to be a story at least to look back on, rather than sitting in a job or in a relationship or situation that you don't want and you're thinking about or fantasizing about this alternate life that you could have had. It's much better to just make the decision like you have and just, for better or worse, just ride it out. And like you said, you can always, decisions aren't binary. You can make a decision, and then if that decision is not good, you can slightly pivot and alter and, change degrees a little bit. And then just changing a little bit changes the destination 5, 10, 15 years down the line.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. And I think it's so amazing that we have that ability to make those decisions for ourselves and then act upon them. And I think, it's not for everybody. And, I can sit here and preach about how it's important to take those risks. But it's not going to be so clear cut with everybody, with regard to whatever the responsibilities they have or what's tying them down. But yeah, I think it's a really important thing to take into consideration. And even if it doesn't end up being exactly what you thought it was going to be, it's up to you whether you learn something from it or not.
Yeah.
Right? And so, getting out there in the world, you're always going to learn something. And it's been the best education that I've had. I went through college. I did fine. I had good grades, but I didn't learn so much.
Yeah.
I just okay, I'm going to get this done. But I feel like everything I've learned has been through doing and experiencing.
Yeah.
So it's an invaluable education.
Well, thank you so much, Seth.
Thanks, Zach.
This has been an absolute blast. I hope you guys, I know you guys will enjoy the conversation, and if the animals were able to pick up on anything, you guys were a great audience. So appreciate it, and see you guys later.